you'll end up with two supply chains, a Western supply chain and a Chinese supply chain. And ultimately, this may be very bad for the West because once China starts producing things, it tends to produce at very low cost and wins a great deal of market share. So we may not like the ultimate result. We may be creating a monster from our standpoint. I don't think there is a single case in history where suppressing access to technology has had any long-term benefit for a dominant power.
Now, last October, the US government issued perhaps the toughest semiconductor bans on China. Now it is pressuring Japan and the Netherlands on similar bans. Now, do you think China may or may not survive these US-led sanctions on semiconductors?
I've got no doubt China will survive. The question is, at what cost? As a matter of fact, your correspondent, Chen Feng, had a very good piece on this the other day. I think the sanctions really miss the point. The idea is to prevent China from developing the most, or even obtaining the most advanced computer chips, gate width of below 16 nanometers. Now, for most of the things that really count for an economy, you don't need the super fast chips. They're critical for smartphone handsets. So when Huawei could not get access to the most advanced chips, its handset business more or less shut down. And that was a blow to Huawei, but Huawei's more important business is facilitating industrial automation. So I think Huawei will survive quite well, despite the loss of its handset business. Now, think of a railroad in the 19th century. Once you have a railroad, you can do all kinds of things that weren't possible before. You can mechanize agriculture and produce an enormous surplus and transport it. Before a railroad, you couldn't move the grain. It would rot. So the railroad makes possible a whole range of other technologies. Now, how important is it if the railroad travels at 50 kilometers an hour or 80 kilometers an hour? It's nice to go at 80 kilometers an hour, but it doesn't make a critical difference. For the industrial automation applications, which are key to productivity in China and elsewhere, of course, the mature chips that China can produce itself do a perfectly good job. So I don't think this will stop the most important parts of China's industrial development. The Dutch and the Japanese are very worried that China will develop competitive technologies and they'll lose their business. The Nikkei newspaper in Tokyo had an editorial about this a couple of days ago, saying that the sanctions should be limited, they should not be too broad, they shouldn't hurt Japanese business too much. And the Dutch have more or less said the same thing. So I don't think that America's allies are going to accept the maximum program on sanctions. I think the likely outcome is that China will have to devote a lot of resources, especially human capital, to duplicating what the West already has. It would be cheaper to simply buy the products from the West. You'll end up with two supply chains, a Western supply chain and a Chinese supply chain. And ultimately, this may be very bad for the West because once China starts producing things, it tends to produce at very low cost and wins a great deal of market share. So we may not like the ultimate result. We may be creating a monster from our standpoint. I don't think there is a single case in history where suppressing access to technology has had any long-term benefit for a dominant power.
Thank you. Now, a little bit of follow-up questions is that how do the industry, the chips, semiconductors industries respond and adapt to this scenario? And like you say, if it should come to that.
The semiconductor industry is unique in that the ratio of capital spending to revenues is extremely high. I think that the industry had about $600 billion in sales in 2021, and it spent $170, $180 billion in capital expenditure. That's because technology changes so fast that really every year the industry has to put its whole future at stake in making bets about future technology. Now, many of the major American semiconductor producers, and of course Taiwanese, obtain a very large part of their revenues from China. Qualcomm, NVIDIA, LAM Research, a semiconductor equipment manufacturer. If the Chinese market is cut off, they will lose an enormous amount of revenue. Is the United States government prepared to give subsidies to replace that? The CHIPS Act, which the Biden administration got through Congress, is not a bad idea by itself, but the amount of money offered to the industry over 5 years is less than $50 billion. It adds up to maybe $8 billion a year of subsidies. This is an industry where capital investment is nearly $200 billion a year. So the disruption to the industry by cutting off the Chinese market will be extremely costly. The kind of subsidies which the US government has proposed are much too small to compensate for that disruption. So I don't really understand what the Biden administration is thinking because the numbers don't add up. I think this was a hastily conceived and badly executed program. We simply don't know enough, but it's certainly possible that this could end up damaging US industry. My view is you win, and I want America to be the strongest country in the world. You win not by suppressing your competitors, but by making yourself better. And the danger is that in the process of suppressing China's development, we'll damage ourselves as well. And I don't think that's the best policy for us.